Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending today's webinar, Why Customer Experience Matters in Specialty Care, presented by Exeevo. I'm Andrea Anderson, and I'll be moderating this webinar. Our speakers today are Mohammed Issa, Vice President, Commercial US, Janssen Neuroscience, and Chris Wade, Associate Vice President, Strategic Solutions, Exeevo. You can read their full bios on the left side of your window by selecting the Speakers tab. Just a few technical notes before we begin. The webcast is being streamed through your computer, so there is no dial-in number. For the best audio quality, please make sure your volume is up. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on demand within 24 hours after the event. Time permitting, we will follow the presentations with a Q&A session. Please submit your questions using the Questions and Answers tab on the left side of your screen. All right, let's begin. Mohammed, please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Andrea and Chris, for having me. Excited to be with you here today. And thanks for the audience for joining us for this important discussion. Clearly, if you're taking the time to listen to this, I'm gathering that customer experience is an important topic in your day-to-day. And obviously, you're working really hard to exceed and delight your customers as you're serving them. So looking forward to the discussion. Chris?
Thanks very much, Mohammed. So, and, on behalf of Exeevo, I can only, extend our deep thanks and gratitude to Mohammed for agreeing to being involved in this session and, to help, share his insight and experience, but also to all of you who are taking the time out of your day to join us. So I'm Chris Wade. I'm the head of strategic solutions at Exeevo. We're a cloud solutions company focused on customer experience and omnichannel in the life sciences space. So we partner with Microsoft on a global basis and develop solutions for, addressing, how companies are looking to evolve their CRM capabilities, going deeper into digital, omnichannel, and, unification of their customer experience processes across their organization. So what we're going to be covering, in the session is looking at, 4 different topics around this idea of customer experience and why it both, is relevant to and really matters in the setting of specialty pharmaceuticals and specialty care. So we'll be spending about 40 minutes doing that. We'll have time after that to take questions. And hopefully anything that's popped into your minds on the way, make a note. You can record the questions into the system, and we can then take care of those, at the end of the session. So let's get going. So customer experience, and why it matters. So perhaps it's not the most obvious topic to be looking at when we consider an environment like this that is particularly in a payer-led setting. And when customer experience has often been seen as something which is very consumer focused, very based, focused by organizations trying to build loyalty, repeat business and the like. But what we see is some very interesting data, points coming from research, which really shine a light on not just how customer experience can be thought of and applied differently, into the setting we're working in, but how broad it is and how important it is to all of the stakeholders. And this sort of opening point is based on data from McKinsey that looked at how payers were approaching the question of what can they do to improve the value to patients. What are the procedures? What are the activities that are important? That have demonstrated impact to ultimately, what is best seen as that patient's experience. And I think it's, this is where I think is a great point to sort of start the conversation around with Mohammed, around, how industry is playing a role, a very key role in enabling these kinds of services. So over to you, Mohammed.
Yeah, Chris, thanks very much. And look, just by way of quick introduction, I get the great fortune of leading the commercial team at Janssen Neuroscience, where we have a portfolio dedicated to schizophrenia, mood disorders as well as neurodegenerative illnesses. And the team that I, get the pleasure of working with we're really working tirelessly to make sure that we are making mental illness and neurodegenerative diseases and their debilitating consequences a thing of the past. That's just part of the Janssen mission where we operate. And when we think about those diseases and the patients that are impacted by them, to us, and you mentioned it, Chris, customer experience is at the core of that, right? Because at the end of the day, we're not focused on anything other than making sure that the patients that we serve receive and can take the transformative medicines that we have to offer in a way that maximizes their clinical outcomes and obviously improves and sustains their lives. So when you think about, customer experience and, why it's important now, right, you started the conversation by a payer-led environment. I think now we see more than ever, which I think is a great move in general, in that payers are, excuse me, are assessing not only clinical outcomes, but patient experience as part of their scores, and part of reimbursement mechanisms, both now and in the future, will likely move into customer experience and patient outcome type measures if they haven't already done so in the respective areas that the folks listening are operating in day to day. We take that one as a step forward in the conversation to make sure that obviously patients are going through their patient journey with as less as a friction point as possible, but also thinking about customers uniquely and thinking about all the different customers in the ecosystem that we serve. So I think the first thing that we might want to just highlight here, Chris, just to maybe start the conversation, and I'd love your thoughts on this, is, when thinking about customer experience, we first have to start by asking ourselves who the customer really is. And in most cases, I think we're going to naturally gravitate towards the patient, which should be at the center of the ecosystem. But then you have to ask yourself, well, who are the other customers that we're serving that are also adding, if not contributing, to that overall patient experience? Once you identify then those customers and what they need versus what they're already getting, I think the steps from there, naturally have to start by identifying what their journey is, perhaps what their buying process is, mapping that out, excuse me, with detail, but also mapping that out with empathy, because you want to take a rational approach to the journey that they're embarking on and what maybe barriers and friction points they're experiencing along their journey, but then also consider very quickly what their emotions are as long on that journey and what they're naturally going through. And through that, you then have to then think about what is in your control to help alleviate, and perhaps what are the experiences that you want to make sure that they gather. The more we think about that, the more we can ensure that obviously patients get the medicines that they need, but then to the point where you started, Chris, and again in a payer favorable or payer led dynamic, we can also think about outcomes that are much more favorable that benefit the broader ecosystem, whether it be the payer, the patient, or the HCP that's associated with that journey. So a lot there to unpack, and I'm looking forward to the discussion over the next couple of minutes to do so.
Thanks, Mohammed. I think it's particularly interesting to contrast, I suppose, the rational with the emotive, because when we think about the very concept of customer experience, I guess it naturally leans towards addressing and reducing friction around the emotional support that essentially that patients need. These are at the most challenging times in their lives. What role do each of the stakeholders, each of the players who help to support that patient's diagnosis, their treatment, and ongoing care, what is that role, and how can that essentially contribute to reducing or ideally eliminating friction or confusion? And I guess that's often been one of the challenges in how, when we look at how as an industry we've probably tended to operate historically, where there was a very the direct commercial path was to the decision maker, be that the initially the prescriber, but also the emergence of payers and and their central role in the the health economy now. In all of that, it's very easy to forget to isolate to say the patient's at the heart of what we do, but it's not at the heart of how we've behaved. And I think that leads to a reassessment of not just what we're setting out to try and do as companies, as teams, as an industry, but very much how we're going to approach doing it. And that, I suppose, is that's where we come in. As Exeevo is looking at addressing that challenge of how do you address all of your customers, and how can you build out the right kinds of approaches, channels, plans, tactics, etc., that both address the specific needs and decision challenges that each of those stakeholder groups have, but then also come together around a cohesive, unified view to say this is ultimately focusing what we can do at particular patient audiences. And I think it was interesting, that I think the reason we chose this McKinsey study as sort of a kickoff point was, it's dealing with something, it couldn't be more rational. It's looking at what are those interventions that help, and the degree of assistance that they provide, and then what is the role of industry as a partner to healthcare organizations to make this possible. But also, to your point, Mohammed, this is a long process. This is not a one-shot fix where there's just one thing that you try and do and that's going to sort everything out. It's a long journey that you're going to be working with and supporting the patients with very often very challenging conditions. And I think that's often one of the aspects around the whole kind of CX discussion is it's been too front loaded onto the diagnosis and treatment decision, and that's almost become the end point rather than looking at it in the long term.
Chris, I think you bring up some really good points. And I think first and foremost, it's the empathetic patient journey. And I think the more we can focus on that empathetic patient journey, the more we can really dive into the emotions that our patients and our customers are, generally feeling along that journey, right? Because I think when taking just a rational process, you're going to naturally focus on, rational problems with rational solutions. But when you're dealing with patients that are going through the diseases that we're all working to address, right? Whether it be neuroscience, oncology, immunology, high impact diseases that are impacting themselves and their families, the journey is really quite turbulent and emotional, right? And then to your point, it's really taking that empathetic point of view that I think really, really matters. And, the other point that I think is really important is these customers that we're talking about in our world now, whether they be patients or healthcare providers or payers or population health decision makers, and the list goes on, these folks are consumers of products outside of the healthcare arena, right? And their expectations are set based on their life experiences, not just their consumption of healthcare. So when they are consuming, whether it be technology products, retail products, consumer products, things in their natural day-to-day discourse, and then they come into a healthcare arena and consume products with a lower ability to really meet, exceed, and delight their expectations, their natural tension points that will naturally exist, right? So we almost have to, as a healthcare industry and as a pharmaceutical company, I know as our organization does, really hold ourselves to a much higher bar in exceeding our customers' expectations, besides what we've always done in healthcare, but more importantly, what do our customers expect, just because they're customers of everyday things outside of just healthcare. And then when you layer on top of that the burden that a disease adds, when you add on top of that the burden and the financial implications that being debilitated has. When you add on top of that the turbulence and the natural anxiety that comes knowing that your loved ones may be impacted by your own healthcare concerns, the bar is set even higher, right? So, and again, I think we're going to talk about this, but the more we really can think about identifying those emotions and those tension points that exist, in addition to all the rational barriers that exist in navigating such a complex healthcare ecosystem, the more not only I think we'll be able to delight our customers, but I sincerely believe the more we can positively impact patient outcomes.
Absolutely. I think just moving on to another sort of a perspective on on this question of what is good CX. What contributes to a positive or friction reducing experience. I think a lot of that probably it's good is probably best seen, or excellent is best seen as you make you almost can make yourself invisible. You can be a vital cog in the wheel of treatment, but if the ideal state probably is the patient probably really isn't that aware of you as any one part of that process. It just feels like it's working together for their benefit. Now, and this was quite an interesting study that was done by DT Consulting and Carnegie last year, and it looked at a number of different. It was a focus on, it was a patient survey. And it was focusing on a cluster of initiatives that patients reported being offered by pharmaceutical companies, and what it looked at was what was the value of those. And I think what was particularly interesting was when you look to that sort of far bottom left corner of really sort of the things which were perceived as being least valuable to the patient. In my mind, a lot of these really resonated with some of the things that I've heard people talking about when they talk about patient engagement programs, the kind of data that companies are keen to gather. And then if you look to the at the other end of the scale, those activities which have been services facilitated by manufacturers have been arguably at a very low level, mundane day-to-day basis, they make a difference. These are the things that actually are helping patients better manage their health, their condition, their treatment, so that they have the best possible chance of the minimal possible impact on their quality of life. And I think it talks a lot to that, I guess, what has often been a perceptual gap between perhaps what we're trying to achieve in our mind. We sort of think we're being helpful, but actually how it's perceived by a patient. I mean, for example, submitting information on their treatment, in the eyes of the patient, I'm sure they probably think like, I do that a great deal, but with my clinical doctors and people in the healthcare setting, why would I be sharing that information? And what how does it help me? And I think it's absolutely realistic to remember that, in the same way that, as you referred, the empathetic journey, it is it's a time of natural selfishness. That the patient is caring about themselves, their health, their loved ones, those closest to them, and what we're doing is hopefully making that easier, making that better.
Chris, we take a really strong perspective here, at least here in our organization, that we don't just want to engage with our patient population and the HCPs that care for them at point of just brand choice. When focused just on brand choice, it becomes a very selfish transaction. It becomes, what do I give because I want something in return? Instead, if you really consider the patient journey from, even before diagnosis, right? Their general ailments that led them to receive care. And then think about what happens from diagnosis all the way through survivorship and what the patients need at that point, and then what they're receiving from the healthcare ecosystem and where gaps may still fall, and their ability to navigate that entire end-to-end journey, and what our role could be in education, in support, in navigation, in financial resources, in simply just helping them navigate the system for no other good other than to get them to that far end of the journey, which is really survivorship in whatever disease that they're dealing with. The transaction is much less one of give and take and much more of give, which in reality, the patient outcomes will inherently be much more positive, and the patient experience will certainly be much more delightful. Now, the reason why I share this with you, and I took a look at this at these data not too long ago, in that most companies will rate themselves pretty high on the customer experience score because they're thinking about their role in the journey at that brand choice and maybe even one or two steps after that. So their self assessment is extraordinarily high. But when you ask providers and patients, hey, what was your general experience? Their assessment is generally poor because, again, in isolation, when thinking about two or three steps of the maybe 9, 10 plus steps, you're going to naturally inflate the amount of value that you're bringing to the conversation versus if you take a step back and understand what that patient and that provider and that customer in general is going through, the conversation really starts to broaden quite quickly. We have an organization now here at Janssen that is dedicated to patient experience and customer solutions. This is a centralized capability. We have a very senior leader of that group that works across the therapeutic areas to really think about deploying resources and building centralized capabilities to really think about the patient experience in that type of comprehension versus in the isolation that you mentioned in the past. We might have once considered. So I think this is the world that we're going to live in now and in the future, and I would suspect that most organizations are going to be thinking about similar types of investments.
Mohammed, I suppose, from the perspective of, as a commercial organization, the relationship between doing a better job at addressing the reality of the patient situation over that long term, the role that the patient, their family, providers, the healthcare professionals they're going to be working with very closely across time. Do you see this is actually driving not just, I suppose, an ethically better way of approaching this challenge, but it does actually translate to better business?
I mean, there's no doubt about it. I think first and foremost, we have to really consider, Chris, that we are in the business of saving and sustaining human life, right? We're not in the business of just delivering on a P&L. As most people here at Janssen and J&J at large would probably tell you, we always come to the conversation with patient commitments and then organizational commitments. We live by something called the Credo, which always puts the patient and our HCPs first in all that we do and the decisions and the investments that we make. And obviously our shareholders are important, but quite admittedly, they're the last stakeholder that we consider when thinking about all other things, because we believe that when we really meet and exceed customer expectation, shareholder and business returns will naturally follow. So your point, I think, is really well taken. I think the world that we live in and the business that we operate in are one that patient centricity has to be at the forefront, because anything other than that is not sustainable. Anything other than that, you might win in the short term, but you certainly won't win in the long term. And then I think in the environment that we operate in, being a manufacturer, at least on the pharmaceutical side of things, we have to think about the regulations and the legalities that limit sometimes all the things that we would like to do. There's a multiple of things that we're interested in doing that we would love to contribute to the healthcare ecosystem, but naturally there's always a little bit of a give and take as to what exactly you can do. And this is where this centralized capability that I mentioned a few minutes ago is really working to help us identify, right? Helping us identify what can a brand contribute, what can an organization contribute, what can advocacy and policy groups in the general area that we operate in contribute, what can the healthcare ecosystem naturally contribute, and then how do we put all that together to make sure that the patient experience is one that's really, really positive. Again, with the, that being the means to an end, and the end being, optimal patient outcomes, right? And really maximizing the likelihood of success for that patient, their caregiver, as well as obviously their provider.
It's it's fascinating, and I think it heralds I suppose what would hope a reevaluation, not just within organizations, but I think critically in wider society, of the purpose of a life sciences organization. Because I think clearly there have been challenges at points in time in the past around how industry has been perceived, typically very unfairly. But it wasn't seen as being on the right side of the ledger, as it was in terms of the value that it is providing, the help it is able to provide through means other than beyond the medicine itself.
And Chris, I would also say that we have to change that narrative, and we have to take that responsibility. And we have to start thinking about why does that narrative exist in the first place? And primarily it's because the experience has been negative, right? Primarily it's because some customers have seen us really transact, like we mentioned earlier, at that point of, brand choice. It's like, hey, you weren't here when I was diagnosed. You weren't here when I was going through, my ups and downs. You're only here when it's time to choose you or someone else. Clearly, there's going to be a perception there that you're in it for yourself, right? Clearly, there's going to be a perception there that you're in it for all the wrong reasons. But again, if we start to take a step back and start to think about the disease areas that we work in and the ecosystem that we're serving within those disease areas with the patient at the center, and the more we can start to contribute to the overall value and the journey for those patients that are going through them, again, empathetically, right, with a focus on what they're going through, not just what product they're choosing, knowing that if you do all of those things right and you do have a best-in-class product that meets the needs and obviously exceeds the clinical needs for that patient, naturally that will take place. Patient outcomes are naturally improved, and I think business is naturally much more sustainable. So and I'll give you a very tactical example of something that we're considering now, right? We're considering this even in a during pandemic and a post-pandemic environment, the notion of the dispersion of healthcare, right? Healthcare now is being dispersed to the patient versus asking the patient to come to it. You see a lot of services, and you see a lot of providers are using technology to meet patients where they are versus asking patients to come to them, whether that be through telemedicine or whether that be through other types of services. And we have to be at the forefront of that. We can't expect that the retail, quote unquote, retail experience of healthcare is going to remain the same. Patients may not always go into the doctor's office. They may not always go into a hospital setting. They might go into an urgent care setting. They might go to their local pharmacy. They might go to kind of a mobile healthcare center. They might receive healthcare at the luxury and comfort of their home. How does that change the journey? And how does that change our role, knowing that historically we were focused on that, a little bit of an antiquated retail experience in healthcare, right? Those are the things that I think we really have to dissect and think about, not only where healthcare is now, but where it is in the future, for us to really exceed, those customer expectations.
Yeah, it's very interesting, I think, and it's when you kind of look at this kind of, it's a very simplistic representation, but as we've seen this, shift from decision-making power essentially, in the hands of the healthcare professional, to what we just, what we see now as a, whether you want to describe it as payer-led or, more or more disparately driven. I think, the classic view would be, well, this presents all sorts of commercial challenges because you have centralized decision making, which I suppose historically tended to be very uniform, that, there would be policies and standards that a central body such as a payer would determine, and everybody had to follow those rules. And I guess what we're seeing as an inversion of that model is actually because the providers themselves have the means to invest in being able to support patients and health customers where they are in a better way than, forcing them, saying you've got to go and see your, your family doctor, your MD, your specialist, all of that process. It's actually creating more opportunities for transformation, for improvement, that I think perhaps some people would initially think, like, actually this is going to make it harder.
Chris, I think the illustration is really quite good, because I think it shows that it's not going to be one or the other. It's going to be something in between, because I think we would be remiss if we implied that the world that we used to live in will no longer have any relevance. You're still going to have a payer, formulary, right? You're still going to have in-network versus out-of-network. You're still going to have population health decision makers that are making formulary decisions for a patient population in their respective institution and or network, right? All of those things will naturally happen, but we're also seeing, and we'll see more and more, this notion of shared decision making, right? Those decisions that once were made by a really select few, where maybe in some cases no one really knew who was actually making some of those decisions, because they sat in a really far off world. We know now who those decision makers are, but those decision makers are not making those decisions in isolation. They're taking counsel from key opinion leaders. They're taking counsel from patients and caregivers, and they're taking counsel from experts in the space, whether it be, advocates or policymakers. So now the ecosystem as to how those centralized decision-making folks are actually, deploying some of those decisions within their networks is one that's multifactorial, right? Versus, historically it was, hey, show me the science and show me the money and the economics of it, and let me make a decision after you leave the room. It's a much different type of conversation. When you think about that world and those decisions being made that way, coupled with the fact that at the local level, where patients are meeting their HCPs, patients are far more informed today than they ever were informed, because of the advent of data and information that's available at their fingertips. Patients are coming into the doctor office with a slew of information, some accurate, some not so much. Part of our responsibility is to make sure that they're going in with as accurate information as possible. And then to ensure that we're helping enable a conversation between the provider and the patient and their caregiver to have a really fruitful discussion, versus one where they're spending 90% of the time, fixing misinformation that the patient may have naturally gathered. Because when good information is shared at the patient level, the provider level, and was made in a centralized level, that naturally leads to the best possible decision for the patient, the most frictionless journey that patient can go on, the less tense of an experience. Imagine a world where a patient is coming in, they thought they knew something, they leave, wait, I thought I knew this, but my doctor just told me that, and they told me that their system doesn't use this. And so now think about an already tense situation for a patient just got even more tense. So part of, or a mechanism to reduce the temperature is to naturally make sure that people have the right information at the right time, through a channel and through a language that they can all understand. When you have that natural energy happen, not only are you removing barriers along that journey, but I think you're also reducing the tension along that journey and making that a much more positive process. And I think that's where you're seeing this illustration. Like when I think about your illustration, that's what I see. I see Centralized decision making now being multifactorial, HCPs having a set of information that they have to operate within and guardrails that they're operating within. Part of that is assessing their success on patient outcomes and patient experience, and then patients coming into the conversation with the right information to have a fruitful dialogue to then make the best decision for themselves and for their family, knowing that they're going to have the support once that decision is made.
But I can imagine, within the model, within your organization at Janssen, the role that that customer solutions team is playing, being able to, and I think about how a field representative would have worked. They had their target customers, very deeply focused on the relationships and understanding what was going on in the organizations that they were working with. They sort of had, it was their world, at a territory by territory basis. You're now dealing in an environment where there are the complexity of almost, any decision is based on so many drivers that, without that central capability to be able to bring data together, to make sense of data and use that to support decision making, I'm sure from when, in your own career, you've seen just such an enormous shift in the commercial perspective of, how are we going to do this as a commercial team?
There's no doubt. I mean, and I think most of the folks, that might be listening in, and I know you've experienced the same, Chris, historically, you would have an army of sales representatives that go out and focus primarily on the prescribing healthcare provider. And behind them, you'd have a marketing organization that enabled that one conversation to go as positive as possible, focused on one part of the journey. In fact, you would usually start that conversation by saying, hey, doctor, when a patient comes in and looks like this, right, would you agree that this is the type of, you're already narrowing not only the stakeholders through that just singular focus, you're narrowing where you're seeing that patient and what they're going through at that point, right? Naturally focusing on that one transaction. Now in this evolved commercial model, based on everything that we just described a few minutes ago, you have folks that are still connecting with the provider because that's an important form of education, but you also have key account managers who are conversing with population health decision makers, whether they be in institutions and or at the payer level. You're having patient access specialists that once patients are identified, they're actually helping the office and the patient, relieve any burden of getting and staying on therapy. You have patient navigation, basically patient, support that starts much earlier in the journey that helps patients navigate the whole process. You have medical science liaisons that are speaking at a much higher clinical level, not only in the past where they were focusing on researchers, but now on day-to-day, providers and population health decision makers that just need a different level of scientific support. You have another group that's, sometimes focused on access and reimbursement. You have another group that might be focused on buy and bill customers to help educate them on the operations and the back end systems. And then you have a digital group, right? An omni-channel group, and obviously experts like yourselves in your organization that starts to think about, okay, with all that information, how do we synthesize that and communicate that through a channel that customers can appreciate and can engage with? The complexity just got exponentially higher, right? And through that exponentially higher complexity, we have two options. We can meet that complexity with more complexity and just make it a really messy system, or we can try to simplify that complexity and meet customers where they are, hence that patient journey outlook that we described much earlier. So this past, present and future dynamic, we have to expect to become more and more complex, but our job as commercial leaders is to try to simplify that, because the more it gets complex, the more tense it's going to be. Again, I go back to the empathetic journey, and the more tense it is, the less information is consumed, the less information, the less patient outcomes. And I think it's our responsibility to try to simplify that as much as possible.
Absolutely. And I think, this is these, I've got a couple of views that we borrowed from a white paper that Deloitte published specifically on this topic of patient engagement. And I think it sort of sets, it talks very nicely to, what we've been discussing around, the empathetic journey and how it starts, and the role that an organization such as yours sees itself playing, not in telling the HCP this is our ideal patient, have you got anybody like this, but to take it back to first principles of what is the science that we know, how do we use that science to help educate healthcare professionals and specialists in this area, how do we collaborate with them on identifying unmet needs, because they still play a critical role in that early stage, or they play the critical role in the kind of early stage identification of a lot of these conditions, that it will probably be as a result of just an annual checkup, or a visit for something else, that the patient asks their doctor a particular question, and it might well be it's like, oh, that's a warning sign, that is potentially the start of that patient's what ultimately becomes a treatment journey, or that their journey with that particular disease. And I think it was this the sort of other part. Oh, we'll come to the other part of this perspective, but it just mapping this out as these are the different areas where patients express are looking for help. They're looking at what's going on in their life, and it's like, I'm not feeling right, and it might be a gradual thing. It might be obviously be very sudden. And that that in part is the nature of the conditions that they are burdened with, but also them as an individual. And I guess it's is this something which this resonates very well with how you at Janssen think about this idea of the empathetic journey?
Chris, I think there's a couple of things on this that I think we need to probably highlight. The first one is this, and I think it's accurate, but I think we have to almost interpret it also maybe with a little bit of a different lens, in that this assumes that the patient is going through the journey and going through these steps, which I think is accurate. But there's going to be a world where these things are going to the patient versus the patient going to them. And I think we have to almost think about the patient as, at the end of the day, consuming all of this information versus them going out to go get this information. I think those are two fundamentally different things. So that's one area that I think that I reflect on when I think about this journey. I also think about the heterogeneity of the journey, because a patient with caregiving support versus a patient without, a patient that lives in a part of our healthcare ecosystem here in the US that has an exorbitant amount of care and expertise, versus those who might be a little bit further out. We know that actually the healthcare experience is very different when you go from state to state, even zip code to zip code, right? And the disparities that exist within that. You think about patients from a different cultural and even socioeconomic perspective that may or may not have information, but also access. And you think about all of those different types of journeys, and you think about what our responsibility, forget our role, right? What I'm going to probably implore, the folks who've had, who've taken the time out of their day to listen to this conversation, hopefully engage here in a few minutes, is to really think about, this is not about your role. This is about your responsibility to try to get these patients and these providers the information that they need at a point where they need it, that is not just focused on a part of the transaction that you benefit from, that is at the end of the day anchored in improving patient outcomes as the sole purpose for why we do what we do. If you can do that, you're going to naturally think about this journey a little bit differently. And I think you're going to naturally consider the different types of journeys that exist, for different types of patients and different types of populations, whether they be one zip code away, whether they be from a cultural background that may be very different, or whether they may have or may not have support that they need and access that they need to get the care that they require. So there's a lot there. And again, I'm sorry if I'm kind of, throwing a lot out there, but the punchline here is our responsibility is to dissect this journey and to consider us going to the patient versus forcing the patient to come to the information and to the healthcare system, because not everybody has the same privilege.
Yeah. And I guess it's also, I suppose there's a lot of discussion around personalization at a general level, but if people expect that this is the way that we do it, we've designed a journey, and I think I suppose a lot of people talking in those sorts of terms from probably a marketing led perspective, where they're sort of thinking it's something that they can very much sort of plot out what those steps are, rather than thinking about in a more frankly slightly more reactive way or anticipatory way of, if we understand, the more we understand, I suppose those variances in service, variances in opportunity and inequality, then you have that ability to then shape those services and those access points in a way that makes them accessible. Because I suppose the sort of the tag it uses, forcing customers to come to you, is, I suppose, being the history of a lot of digital initiatives in life sciences, where how many websites do we have, how many apps do we create, how many portals do we have, and the customer's always on the other side of the road, just passing us by. It's like, well, what are we doing wrong? It's like, well, we're not putting ourselves where they are, for at a very simple level.
And Chris,
I'm
we're going to
mindful
have to
that
use technology and data to get there. I'm sorry, I would just add there, right? We're going to have to. With the advent of technology and data, we can personalize this experience, and we can think about almost a revolution as to how healthcare is delivered, right? Imagine a world where a patient is using their iPhone to take a video or a picture of a rash on their arm that they could send to their provider, and within 2 hours, they have a prescription to pick up at the pharmacy down the street. Like, that's not the journey of the past, right? The journey of the past is a patient has that rash, they have to call and make an appointment, maybe get in there 3 or 4 days later, perhaps after that, consider all of these different subspecialties that they may have to go. A month journey could literally be a 60 to 90-minute experience for a patient, and without the right information and the right access, that can go grossly wrong, right? And with data and technology and knowing where those patients are, what they need, and how they're communicating, again, I really implore us to think about our responsibility to play our part in that revolution that's to come.
Fabulous. I'm just looking at the clock, and I'm mindful I'm sure we've got a few questions queuing up. So let's move across to those.
All right, yes, we will move on to the question and answer time. There is still time to submit your questions using that Q&A tab that's on the left of your screen. We have a lot of great questions already, and we will try to get to as many as possible. For our first question, how can SP plan to improve patient customer experience?
Chris, you want to go first?
I think a lot of what we've been talking about hopefully resonates around there. So the first part is a willingness, I suppose, at an organizational level to actually address this challenge, and not to just approach it, say, business as usual, let's keep doing what we've been doing, we might add some additional services in. I think there is a need at a leadership level to acknowledge that the way that we are organized as businesses has to evolve, and in some cases evolve quite substantially. At a more practical level, yes, there has to be a deep focus on understanding data, the importance of data, being able to aggregate, bring together and enrich information and use it to sort of democratize decision making within organizations. So the owner of the data is not necessarily at a departmental level. Data is an asset for the whole business and needs to be leveraged in that way, so that we break down perhaps some of these sort of barriers of ownership and empire that perhaps have existed in some organizations historically. If it's data for medical that's providing insights into aspects of unmet need, then that is vital that other parts of the organization can learn from that. Obviously not at within bounds of privacy, not at potentially named customer level, but certainly in terms of what do we learn from the information that we have and how can we use that to drive decision making.
All right, another question here. How can digital technology play a part in improving the patient experience?
Yeah, I mean, Chris, if you don't mind, I'll take that first, and then I'll obviously pass it to you. I think things like artificial intelligence, things like the aggregation and the synthesis of these data, things like omni-channel analytics could help us identify, more importantly, what patients are looking for, where those friction points lie, and in an ideal world, predict where those barriers may actually come into play and really impact the journey, and then consider what are the solutions with very quick ways to assess the impact of those solutions along that journey, to then better understand whether or not those friction points are real, whether or not our work is making progress, and more importantly, how do we get ahead of them and predict them and prevent them versus being reactive to them, right? I mean, think about all of us in our kitchen on a Sunday morning, literally speaking to someone in our family about brown shoes, and next time you log into Amazon, for whatever reason, you have a bunch of brown shoes and a bunch of brown belts that are available to you at your disposal with all of these customer reviews that are telling you which ones are preferred, right? That's digital, and that's technology, and that's artificial intelligence at its best. And we would be remiss if we didn't think about using similar types of infrastructure to improve the healthcare journey, the patient journey, the HCP journey, and overall patient outcomes. But there's a role there, and I think the biggest opportunity, if I had to summarize it, is to help us predict where the barriers are and get ahead of them versus react to them once they arise, because at that point it might be too late.
Yeah, and I think it's I think we're at a very interesting point in our own journey with digital technology. I suppose when we think about how this the systems that we tend to have in our organizations today, if we think about your sort of classic CRM system, it's got lots of data in it. It's got customer records. It's got interaction histories. There's lots of information there, but it's all very structured. And when you talk to people in the field of data science and AI, what they often tell you is the great majority of information that we receive and that is available is unstructured data. This is unstructured data. What we're doing now is vision. We are watching something, we're hearing things. There is some structured information. It's what's on the slides and the like. But hopefully, the value in the session is the discussion. And if we look at how fast technology is moving in areas like this, where if you think about that the classic Google setting of we spoke about brown shoes, now you want to sell me brown shoes, and applying that to a setting where a patient is having a video consult with a health provider, and as part of that consult, not just what they're saying, but there are proven proven indicators in the language they're using, in their skin tone, things like that, which can indicate health issues. We do it naturally, saying you're looking a bit off color. You don't get that when you type something in on a screen, but you do get that if you can actually understand and analyze appearance. And this sort of huge volume of unstructured data, which is constantly being generated, but is not being used ultimately to drive where we're trying to get to in terms of improvement for patients. That's where we're going to see, I think, the great acceleration of what digital can do. And I think there's a question around around omnichannel as well, and it's kind of along the same lines. We're talking about going from a way of doing business which was sort of fairly one-dimensional, in terms of a channel or a part of the organization, to being able to combine multiple parts. But if all we're doing is just increasing the amount of sort of structured data around that, we lose the opportunity from a predictive perspective. When we think about what is the role that AI should be playing in helping us determine what that personalized journey is, because it's never going to be done there's never going to be the resources for a company to have a team of people sitting there designing personalized journeys. It can't work like that. They have to rely on technology and data and evidence to create those personalized experiences, which they can then offer through the set of channels that they can and touch points that they can work with. So it's kind of, I just was skinning down the questions, and I'm sort of combining a few of them.
Yes, thanks for doing that. Was there any other follow-up to the question of patients' journeys are not linear? There's comorbidities, multiple therapies, varied SPs and access process, multiple patient support programs. So how do we define this complex journey when we may not have the full view of all the touch points? I know, Chris, you touched on that a little bit. Is there anything else either of you wanted to add?
No, I think Chris said it best, and I think it's a really insightful question because it's not a linear experience, and I think that's exactly right. And that's where the data and the technology and the AI can come into play, but also that's where the still required need for human interaction can still also be a contributive factor to learn, right? Whether that's a human interaction through, patient navigation, whether it be a wellness program that has, been in touch and communicates with the patient, whether that's engagement with the healthcare providers that are caring for that patient to understand when and where support is required. Whether or not, again, SPs are a part of that conversation, which I have to believe they are. Those are the things that I think could ensure that it's not a linear process, and between data, AI, technology, and again, that human touch that's not going to be replaced, we can then best identify what's being consumed versus what's still required, and maybe where the patient has progressed and maybe regressed in order to keep the outcomes top of mind. But I think it's a really insightful question, because the world of a patient just kind of moving from left to right is certainly not the reality.
And I think I'll just skip on to the next, because I think the next question is very, very similar as well, and it aligns with that challenge of how does industry better partner in an environment which is inherently complex and nonlinear. So it's not the as much as any one company would like to play a central role, they can't, because patient centricity naturally, of course, pushes what may have previously been at the center to a different relationship. And I suppose the very nature of specialty medicine is such that you're talking about often complex therapeutic treatment approaches which are heavily individualized. So the patient support, the patient experience is ideally shouldn't feel like a confusion of different companies vying to offer me help. How can different manufacturers who are involved in one patient's treatment program actually start to work together? And I think that might be really, I guess from your perspective, Mohammed, how do you see that evolving in an area like neurodegenerative disorders?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think we go back to where we started and thinking about the journey more comprehensively, and to the question that came earlier, in a dynamic fashion versus transactional at just a brand choice. And I think that's where we can contribute. And I think if taken that perspective, there's an opportunity to contribute much broader than maybe we once thought we can. And again, I think our responsibility to improve outcomes, I think naturally is a part of that, right? So, a big part of what we do in neurodegenerative diseases and even in our other therapeutic areas is really think about that patient in aggregate, what they need, where they are, and how they're navigating, and less about the point as to which the product is being chosen. Because if isolated to that, I think we lose a lot of opportunity to contribute and help, along the way.
Fabulous. So I'm just going to say, a massive thank you firstly to everyone who's taken the time out of their day to join us, but in particular to Mohammed for sharing, his willingness to share, his perspective, his experience, and really have a very open and full discussion about this topic. So on behalf of Exeevo, I can only say a huge thank you to all of you. Thank you for joining us, and as Andrea said, we'll be sharing this video very shortly, and very much look forward to being in touch with all of you. Any questions you might have around this great topic of customer experience and omnichannel. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. We did have plenty of questions, and even though we couldn't get to them all, we will do our best to get back to everyone who submitted personally after the webinar. Thank you so much for attending this Fierce Pharma webinar and for submitting so many great questions. I'd like to thank our speakers for participating and Exeevo for presenting today's webinar. This webinar has been recorded. You will be able to access the recording within 24 hours using the same audience link that was sent to you earlier. Thank you again for joining, and we look forward to seeing you at future events.